let's move on. So let's go through a quick agenda for today's session. We'll start off with a brief introduction to Next Gen Corda, also known as Corda 5. And we're going to go through the prerequisites for local development with the CorDapp Standard Development Environment, the CSDE. And then we're also going to explore what the CorDapp Standard Development Environment involves. And we'll finish off with a walkthrough of an IOU sample CorDapp. So hopefully this session will be helpful for you. And without further ado, let's get started. So let's start off with a brief introduction to Next Gen Corda, also known as Corda 5, as I mentioned. So the main feature of Next Gen Corda is to start small. So it's designed to enable anyone to start small and scale as needed. And an entire application network can run on a single laptop with many self-sovereign identities sharing the compute resources. So when it is necessary, Corda supports scaling out to the data center, which enables true centralization of execution as identities progressively move to their own clusters. So number one is start small. Number two is that it's highly available. The worker architecture means that Next Gen Corda can be deployed in a hot, active configuration. So this ensures continuity of execution under fault scenarios. So what does this mean? Basically, if a worker crashes, another one can pick up the checkpointed flow and continue execution. Number three is that you can scale out through horizontal scalability. So thanks to Kubernetes and Kafka, the architecture enables horizontal scaling to facilitate parallel execution of thousands of flows. And capacity can be added or removed as needed via the scaling of the worker community. And lastly, if there is no work, there is no cost, or lower cost to explain that. Identities are not tied to a single executing compute instance. So when it's not in use, aside from some small costs associated with static storage, an identity does not incur any overhead. This, therefore, dramatically reduces the cost per identity. So that's a brief introduction to Next Gen Corda. Now let's take a look at the different prerequisites that are required when it comes to local deployment with the CSDE. So here are some third-party software tools that we'll need. Obviously, we'll need an operating system. You can use Mac, Windows, Linux, whatever you like. And we'll also need Java. So we're using Azul Zulu JDK 11 here. And we also recommend using IntelliJ as your IDE, as we have implemented some really handy Gradle helper tasks, which can help make the development of Next Gen CorDapps a lot smoother for you. And you'll notice that we also have Git included in order for you to clone the CSDE repo from GitHub. And lastly, we actually have Docker included here as one of the third-party software required. And this is slightly different to Corda 4, as you might have noticed, because Docker is kind of like a new concept, the idea of containerized technology. And this is where the CSDE will run. So if you think about Next Gen Corda, there are ultimately two main parts to it. The first part is the development side. So this refers to the CSDE to code the CorDapp. And the second side is the deployment. And this refers to clusters, application network management, Kubernetes, Kafka, etc. And the CSDE simplifies the Kubernetes and Kafka setup process for us as developers, because the cluster-related side of the process has already been pretty much built out for us. So this way, when you're using the CSDE, we can focus more on developing CorDapps rather than worrying about the deployment side of things. And if you're interested in the deployment side of things, don't worry, we'll actually be covering the MGM, or the Membership Group Manager, network setup in 2 weeks' time on the 23rd of February. And there are two sessions to adapt to two different time zones. So feel free to pick one that suits you if you're interested, and sign up to that webinar, and hopefully see you there. So with that being said, let's move on to what else is needed. And this is actually the Corda CLI. command line interface. And we're using the command line interface, the Corda command line interface in the background. So as a result, you actually need to install this beforehand in order to use the CSDE. But I'm not going to show step-by-step how to install it because there is already a step-by-step guide on our docs on how to install that. So if you want to find where that is, basically here, if you go to R3 docs, docs.r3.com, and go into content library in Corda, go to beta 1 and developing, getting started. And here, as I shown just now, there's the prerequisites and also installing the Corda CLI. So just follow these steps, and by the end of it, it should be done. So going back to our slides, let me just check if there are any questions. Doesn't seem to be. Okay, so let's move on to the next step. All right, so let's get into the CSDE. And by the way, if you have any questions throughout this session, feel free to leave them in the Q&A section, and I will check them from time to time just to make sure that I help answer any of them. Okay, so what is a CSDE? Basically, a CSDE makes prototyping CorDapps on beta 1 easier. And it's essentially a prepared CorDapp project, kind of like a template that you can use as a starting point to develop your own CorDapps and prototypes. So it includes a base Gradle configuration that brings in the dependencies that you'll need to write a test Next Gen Corda CorDapp. And it also includes a set of Gradle helper tasks, which speed up and simplify the development and deployment process. And these are effectively the wrappers over the Corda command line interface. And it comes with a debug configuration as well for debugging a local Corda cluster. And lastly, thanks to the CSDE, you'll be able to configure the members of the local Corda network. So I'll show that in a little bit when we dive into the code side of things. So how do we start using the CSDE, you may ask? That's a very good question. Well, to start off, we'll need to download the CSDE, and then we'll configure the CSDE. And lastly, we'll just go through the Gradle helpers for the combined worker and the debug config so that we all know what's kind of happening and going on. So let's download the CSDE to start off with. So here are the steps as to how to download it. Let me just check there are no questions before I go ahead. Yeah. All right, so step 1 is to clone the CSDE CorDapp template Java repository. We also have a Kotlin version depending on what you prefer. For the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to be sticking with the Java version, but feel free to experiment with the Kotlin version as well. It's pretty much exactly the same thing except in Kotlin. So clone the repo, and then step 2 is change to that specific directory and check out to the beta 1 branch. This is quite important as we have many different versions, so make sure you're on the right branch. And then next step is to initialize the Git repo and change the remote. And lastly, we want to open up this project in your desired IDE. So in our case, we're going to use IntelliJ and let the import process complete. So let me just quickly show you how to do that. I'm not going to go through everything because I've already cloned the repo, etc., to save us time. But let's go ahead and let me show you. So here in Corda GitHub. All right. And you can see here, if you just type in CSDE, you'll be able to find the Kotlin version, and we want the Java version. So here. And then you just go into code, and you can choose if you want to clone the HTTPS link or SSH and just copy that and git clone it into your terminal, into your desired folder. So that's basically it. And make sure that you check out to the Corda 5 beta 1 repo. So once that is pretty much done, you will see this screen. So let me go back to the slides so that you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so once we have downloaded the CSDE and we open it in our IDE in IntelliJ, this is basically what you see. And this is what I have in the IDE right now. So let's go through the project structure and kind of what to expect, because at the moment, there's a lot of stuff that you can see here. So let's look into the project structure. So here in our config, we have dev-net.json, excuse me. So this is a JSON file for configuring the Corda application network while running a local combined worker cluster. So what exactly does this mean? So let me just quickly show you in this screenshot. So the JSON config file basically includes all the identities that we want to use in our tests, as well as notaries. And you can play around with identities, you know, if you want to add, at the moment, we have 3 identities. So we have Alice, Bob, and Charlie, as well as 1 notary representative. And we also have the notaries here, but we recommend that you kind of leave the notaries as they are at the moment. So if you do want to play around with this, feel free to add and take away, you know, another identity, but it's fine with what we have here already. It's plenty to kind of work with. So yeah, that's kind of what is in the dev.net JSON file. So going back to the previous slide, and what else is in the project structure? So in logs, we have a directory containing all the logs when running the combined worker. And you might be thinking, is this similar to the logs that we had in Corda 4? If you're familiar with Corda 4, I don't know if you remember, we had like files for each node, and inside these files, we had log files, or inside these folders for each node, we have log files. But basically in Next Gen Corda, instead of having log files for each node, we now have 1 log file for the combined Corda worker. That's the main difference. And then moving on the right-hand side here, you see we have UTXO example and the CSDE template, contract and workflows files and folders. And these are basically source files for your CorDapp, including the My First Flow and the UTXO example. And I will talk through that briefly in a little bit, so don't worry too much about that at the moment. And then moving downwards, you see here the build.gradle file, as well as gradle.properties file. These are files pre-configured for writing and compiling your CorDapp. And lastly, with the external libraries, this is basically all the dependencies pulled in by the Gradle configuration. So with that being said, let's move on. So we've already seen this JSON slide, so moving to the next slide. All right, so now that we've downloaded the CSDE and we kind of explored the different, okay, so let me just answer this question asked by Lokesh. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Is there a place where we can see all the configurable file for dev-net.json? And yes, I believe so. If you look into the docs, you'll be able to have a look and see what exactly is included here. So actually, you'll be able to take a look at what you're able to add. But to be honest with you, at the moment, what is in there is mostly, as I said, the test identities and the notaries. So you either just add or remove identities. But if you want to have more information about what exactly can be included, I can double check with the engineering team and get back to you. So hopefully that helps answer your question. But to be honest, when it comes to CSDE, if you're just trying to build a CorDapp, you won't really need anything else other than tests, identities, and notaries for now. Hope that answers your question. Okay, so that's the only question we had so far. Moving on back to our slides. So now that we've downloaded the CSDE and we can see what the project structure is like and what it includes, we want to make sure we're configuring the CSDE correctly. So one of the main things to look out for is making sure that you're using the right SDK. In our case, for the CSDE, we want to use the Azul Zulu JDK 11 that I mentioned. So How can you check this? If you go into your IntelliJ and you go into your preferences and into build, compiler, build tools and Gradle, here's where you can change it. So just pick the right one and it will import what you need correctly. That's basically it. So now that the CSDE is correctly configured, we can take a look at the Gradle helpers for the combined worker and also debug configuration that is provided for us. So this tool is super handy. When you're developing CorDapps, you'll pretty much use it all the time. It's great, and it makes the development process really smooth and easy. So let's just quickly go through it and see what each of these helper tools actually do, or helper tasks actually do. So to start off, there is the refresh button to reload Gradle config if necessary. That's not specific to Next Gen Corda, it's there all the time anyways. What is specific to the CSDE, however, is here you see the 3 folders. So there's CSDE Corda, CSDE CorDapp, and CSDE queries. So let's start off with the start Corda task. So of course, as it says here, it starts the local Corda combined worker. But what exactly does it do? So actually, the start Corda task downloads and locally stores a copy of the combined worker jar if it is required. And then it starts an instance of the Postgres Docker container. So you need to make sure that you have Docker desktop or Docker engine running in the background before you start the start Corda task or click the start Corda task. And the third thing that the start Corda task does is that it starts the local combined Corda worker. So, and one note, they actually will be using port 8888. And there are also 2 other ports that are mentioned, but the most frequently used one is 8888. So make sure that you're not using this specific port and that you're reserving it for this CSDE task. Okay, and then the next one here, we have stop Corda. So it stops local Corda combined worker, pretty straightforward. So what does that mean? It stops the Postgres database that's running in Docker, and it also stops the combined Corda worker. Okay, next thing to point out is the quick deploy CorDapp. So here under CSDE CorDapp, you see there are 5 different numbered tasks, and you can run these tasks in isolation, but to make your life easier, there's also a quick deploy CorDapp task that you can run. And this basically runs all 5 steps in one go for you. So first, we create the group policy, which basically defines the information required for application networks. And then we create the key store, which is used to sign the Corda package bundler, as well as the Corda package installer. And then number 3 is build CPI, or Corda package installer, as I mentioned just now. So the Corda package installer is pretty much a combination of the Corda package bundler as well as the group policy. And all this information is actually included in our docs if you want to read more about it, or if you're just curious as to what exactly is inside that. And lastly, it will deploy the CPIs and create and register the virtual nodes with the CPI. And that is basically all the tasks involved in this quick deploy CorDapp step. All right, so moving on. We have a CSDE queries folder, and the one that we'll use very often is list virtual nodes, or list vnodes. And this task displays a list of virtual nodes on the local Corda cluster, and it actually aligns with the dev JSON folder with the identities that we went through just now. So we will see in a little bit exactly how that works. So if you're a little bit lost right now, don't worry. I will show you exactly how these tasks run. And also in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the Q&A section so that I can have a look at that. And that's pretty much it. So moving on to the next slide. So now that we've gone through, downloading, configuring, and also exploring the different Gradle helper tasks in CSDE, let's play around with it. So let's set up the CSDE. So we want to start the local combined Corda worker by using start Corda, as I mentioned just now. And I will show you these steps step by step. So let's go through the local combined Corda worker first. So let's go to our IntelliJ. And we just want to double click on start Corda. But basically, because this task will take around a minute for the local combined Corda worker to run, I've just clicked it in advance of time just so that we don't sit around here waiting for it. So once you double click it, it will start the worker. And then in order to check the liveness of the worker, you can click list vnodes here on the right-hand side panel. And if your local combined worker isn't running yet, then you will see like a connection refuse kind of message in list vnodes. However, because I ran this ahead of time and there was already enough time for Corda to finish its startup routine, then we can now see that it's running fine. So let's see on Swagger to check that. So if I refresh here, it loads fine. And if I want to just try out a task or do a fetch, let's see. Let's do a get request. So this is just getting all the Corda package installers that are currently uploaded onto the cluster. So if I execute, it should be empty. So here in the response body, we can see an empty response because obviously we haven't deployed anything yet. So actually, let's go and deploy something. So here, if I do quick deploy CorDapp, this will go through the 5 steps that I mentioned previously in order to deploy the CorDapp. So this will take a little bit of time. Hopefully, it shouldn't take too long. Let me just check and see if there are any questions. I think we're good so far. Also, if you're really confused about anything or lost about anything, feel free to put it in questions. But if you're feeling okay about it, then maybe give me like a hand raise just to show that it's all good. Or yeah, I'm not sure if you can do any other reactions, but just so that I'm sure you're good. Nice, Joaquin, thank you for your hand raise. Cool. And it's still going through the last step now, so it should be done soon. We'll give it a couple more moments. So Christopher asked, what spec machine are you running this on? Do you mean like my actual device? If that's your question that you're asking me on, then I'm just running on a MacBook Pro. Hope that helps. If that is your question. Let me know if that wasn't what you meant. Oh, memory and speed. So actually, in terms of the CSDE, it does tell you what memory you need to allocate to your Docker desktop. So let me just open up my Docker. Oh. At the moment, I have set up in settings. resources, I did 8 gig of memory and 6 CPUs. So that's just what I'm using, but yeah, hopefully that helps. And hopefully that answers your question. Okay, has it finished yet? No problem, Christopher. Okay, so now that we can see that the task is completed, let's take a look back at Swagger and see if it has worked. So how do we check if that has worked? So as I said just now, whenever we haven't deployed the CorDapp yet, the CPIs was responding with an empty response. So if we execute it now, it should include all this information, which is perfect, which is what we want to see. So all good, thumbs up from my side. And the metadata is what we want to see. Okay, so back to the Corda template, the CSDE template. So basically in this template, whenever you clone it from GitHub, it has a very generic 2 folders in the workflows repository. So there is the flow example, which basically is a very simple hello world kind of message workflow. And then we also have the UTXO example workflow, which uses the Ledger pluggable service for a chat app. But today, we're going to take it up a notch because these are things that you can just see from the docs anyways. And actually, we're going to take a look at an IOU CorDapp. And if you want to use a sort of comparison, let me just move on to the next slide. We're going to, yeah, as I said, do an IOU CorDapp walkthrough. So this is kind of similar to the obligation CorDapp in Corda 4 in terms of functionality. So it's basically issuing an IOU from one identity to another identity, and settling the IOU, and also we'll integrate a flow to transfer the particular IOU to another identity. So I'll walk through all those flows in a little bit. But in terms of Next Gen Corda with compared to Corda 4, in terms of the core components, it's actually still quite similar. So it still consists of state, contract, and flows. And if you're not too familiar with these 3 core components, I would really recommend you to check out our Corda 4 content on our YouTube channel, as well as on our docs, because actually we talk about these 3 core components extensively. Whereas in this session, I want to focus more on the CSDE. But as a brief kind of explanation, the state is an object in Corda, which ultimately can be consumed, can be updated, and can be stored. And then contracts verify transactions, and it makes sure that the state changes follow certain rules that we set. And lastly, the flows execute the business logic side for a CorDapp. So with that being said, let's take a look at the actual main differences between Corda 4 and Next Gen Corda with reference to states, contracts, and flows. So in terms of state, there isn't that much difference. The main thing we want to notice or take note of is actually the participant list. So let me just check there are no questions. Okay, so in terms of the participant list for Corda 4, you might notice that in Corda 4, whenever we are creating a state, we use a list of abstract parties. But in Next Gen Corda, we're actually using a list of public keys instead. And in contracts, in terms of the differences of that, we actually keep most of it the same. The only thing that you will find is that in Corda 4, it includes a helper method, a domain-specific language using require that, but it's not currently available yet in Next Gen Corda, but it will be soon. So at the moment, we just manually create require that to kind of use that to write our rules. And in terms of the differences for flows is actually quite different. So, well, on a wider point of view, the architecture and flow logic very much stays similar to Corda 4, but when I say it's quite different, I'm talking about number one, in terms of class parameters. In Corda 4, you can pretty much put anything as class parameters. It's up to the developer to decide. However, in Next Gen Corda, we implemented RPC request data, which is pretty much a JSON format object. And this means that all the parameters for flows in Corda are now standardized, which is great. Another thing that is different in Next Gen Corda is related to flow argument class. So this is the class that carries a parameter object body, and it's a special class implemented to help the flow understand what is being passed in. So actually we'll see that in a little bit in terms of the actual code itself, so that it's easier for you to understand. But basically it just helps the flow understand what is being used, what to expect. And the third difference is injectable service packages. So in Corda 4, you might remember something called Service Hub, where anything that we want to do, we call Service Hub and use the methods available. But in Corda, or in Next Gen Corda, we're using injectable pluggable services. And what difference does this make? So this means that you only add in what you need. And we'll see that in a little bit when I go through the code. And lastly, the main difference is the return response. So in Corda 4, a lot of the times when we write a flow, most of the flows are returning like a signed transaction maybe. And signed transactions aren't always very useful in terms of thinking about what the outcome of the workflow is. And it's just not that nice to work with when compared to a proper return response. So in Next Gen Corda, there is a response body which every workflow will return, as we saw in Swagger. And the response body can include a lot of helpful information, and as a result of that, we can better utilize this response and think of what to do with it. So those are the main differences in terms of Corda 5 and Next Gen Corda when it comes to flows. So moving on. Okay, so let's actually go into the code, and I will kind of show you what is happening. And then we can go into Swagger and run the relevant interactions as mentioned here. So you'll see in a bit, we can do post calls and also get calls. So let's go into the code. So here I'm still in the CSDE CorDapp template. So I just want to stop this. It takes a second. And as you can see here, it actually kills that specific process. So I'm going to switch into the IOU app that I was telling you about and start the Corda. Let me just check that it is properly stopped in terms of, yeah. So it's probably stopped in Docker desktop. So I will hit start Corda and let that run. And whilst we're running, I'm just going to quickly show you, if you would like to explore this specific code in your own time after this session, then you can go into GitHub, and actually we're going to upload this onto the Corda GitHub. It's just at the moment we're trying to find a place for it to go for all the samples. So I'm going to go into, if you go into Corda, at the moment I just pushed it to my personal GitHub, but I will put the link actually in the chat so you can actually see. I'll put it in the chat here. So this is just where it is at the moment, but of course, we will upload this onto the Corda GitHub over the next week or so, I hope. Okay, so back to our IntelliJ. Let's check and see if the combined worker is now running. So how do we do that? Basically run list vnodes. And as you can see, it says connection refused. So it just means it needs a little bit more time. So I'm just gonna wait a little bit more. It does take quite a bit of time, to be fair. But yeah, so if I just quickly talk through the README for this IOU app, it explains what exactly is in the states, in the contracts, and the flows, and also the prerequisites required to run the CSDE, this particular CorDapp. And as I mentioned previously, that's basically related to Docker, specific JDK, etc. And then it also has step-by-step, which we will go through on how to run the CorDapp and also the combined Corda workers. So is it done yet? Yes, okay. So now that the combined worker is running, we can go to Swagger and do refresh. And let me just execute the CPI task. And it is empty. And the reason that it's empty is because I need to run quick deploy CorDapp. So this will take a little bit of time as well. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box while we are waiting for this. And also let me know if the font size is big enough, small enough for you to read. I can always adjust that. So if you have any issues reading it, just give me a shout. Well, I guess put it in the Q&A because you can't really give me a shout because you can't unmute yourself. But yeah, hopefully it is okay for you. We'll just wait a little bit more for this. And whilst we're waiting, I'm interested to ask you, if you were to start building your CorDapp using the CSDE, what kind of apps would you be interested in trying out first? You can put it in the Q&A since the chat is kind of closed, but put in the Q&A, like what kind of app would you want to build? Would it be an IOU app like this one just to try it out? Or would it be something that you already have in mind? Or is it a secret? Okay, so the CSDE CorDapp has been deployed. So let's go back to, let's run vnodes first, list vnodes. So here you can see it's a little bit different now because we have deployed the CorDapp. This means that the test identities are now visible. So here we have Alice, Bob, and Charlie, as well as the notary representative. And what is important to note here is this particular short hash, because it represents Alice in particular. Excuse me. So we'll be using this hash regularly when we're doing API calls, basically get and post calls. All right, so now that we have got this up and running, let's play around with it. This is probably the most exciting part. So be sure to pay attention if you aren't already. I hope you are. Okay, so let's go into our Swagger and let's scroll down a bit. So here you see CPI API and then certificates, you have configuration, you have flow info. Flow management is what we want to use. And you have loads of other ones too, but flow management is the one that we care about right now. So number one, first things first, let's take a look at this get, try it out. Let me just have a quick check on time. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, perfect. So to start off, let's just copy Alice's holding identity short hash, which I mentioned previously here, Alice, copy that, and let's paste it here and let's see what this gives us. So at the moment, we don't have, we have an empty response here because we haven't called any flows yet, right? So we want to take a look at what kind of states and flows we have here. So let's see. Okay, I'll go into flows later. Okay, so let's start off with IOU state. What is an IOU state? So whenever we create the state, basically I made sure to tag it to belongs to contract and that specific contract class. So IOU contract, which is in the contracts folder. And then it implements contract state and it takes these particular parameters, which I have defined here. So there is the unique identifier, which is the ID of that particular IOU state. And we also have the lender, the borrower, the specific amount of the IOU, and also the amount that has been paid, as well as the public key, the list of public keys, which I mentioned earlier, which is different in Next Gen Corda. So this is why we have the list of public keys. So constructor for deserialization, we want to include the ID, the lender, borrower, amount paid, as well as participants. And for this here, whenever we create a new IOU state, if there isn't an amount paid specified, we're just going to default it to 0. And the type of methods included in this state includes get ID, so we can get the ID, get lender, get borrower, get amount paid, as well as the list of public keys. And these two functions are used for settlement and transfer of the IOU. So here, this one is this particular method is used to issue an IOU. This one is used to issue an IOU. And then the bottom process payment is used to settle. And then with new lender is to transfer the IOU to a new lender. Pretty self-explanatory, but I just thought I would mention it. And if we actually look at what happens in process payment, this method takes the amount repayment. So for example, if I want to process payment of $10, then I will update the current amount paid by adding the amount repayment. So for example, amount paid is $0 and amount repayment is $10, then updated amount paid will be 10. And we just update the IOU state with that updated amount paid number. And then with new lender, it takes into the new lender as well as the list of public keys for new participants, and just simply updates the IOU state using the new lender and the list of public keys, new participants. So that's pretty much it for IOU state. Pretty straightforward. And then let's take a look into IOU contract. So as I mentioned earlier, our IOU contract wants to govern the evolution of IOU state. And how it knows that is because I tagged IOU state with belongs to contract, IOU contract, right? So in IOU contract, we want to create 3 commands. One is issue, number 2 is settle, and number 3 is transfer. And what is important to point out here is that we have the require that method, which I mentioned earlier that this has to be manually included, whereas in Corda 4 it's already there for us to use. Oops, sorry, it's already there for us to use. So basically here we just have to define it. This is where I defined it. But yeah, so moving on, now that we have required that function or method, then we set the rules that we want. So for example, when it comes to the issue command, similar to Corda 4, this part is very similar to Corda 4. So basically just setting the rules, making sure that whenever we do an issuance of an IOU, there should be no input states, which is true because we're creating it. And there should only be one output state, and that the output state must be an IOU state or instance of an IOU state. So it's pretty straightforward. And then when it comes to the settle command, we want to require that there's also one input state and that it must be of an IOU state and that there should only be one output state, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I feel like we only have 10 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through all these one by one. So you get the idea. You basically just set rules depending on what you want the IOU state to follow. And lastly, let's quickly go through the flows. So to start off with issue flow, issue IOU flow, notice here that on top of issue IOU flow file, we also have issue IOU flow arguments file or args file. And this pretty much defines the deserialized arguments required to start the flow. So here, in our case, whenever we want to call issue IOU flow, I want to make sure that there is a lender and an amount provided. And these two arguments have to be of a type string. And also provided some methods in order to get this information. And then when we're looking at the flow, notice that here it says RPC startable flow, which means we can use it with RPC. And that, look at all these Corda inject. So here, this is really interesting because this wasn't available in Corda 4. And now in Next Gen Corda, we can implement all these different services. So for example, the JSON marshalling service to help understand what the flow args contain, which is what we define in our issue IOU flow args folder. And also the member lookup to find specific information about specific members. The UTXO ledger service, so that's for the ledger, notary lookup, flow engine. And you can choose what you want. As I said, these are pluggable, injectable services. So for example, if we look at list IOU flow, because this flow only needs 2 services, I didn't include, for example, notary service. I didn't include, what else did I not include? Member lookup, for example, right? So in Next Gen Corda, you really just use what you need to, which is great. So let's take a look at the flow. So what actually happens here? So we start off by deserializing the flow arguments that we defined in issue IOU flow args. So we're getting the request body and we're making it, we're deserializing it. And then we're going to obtain the member information. So here it is the person or the identity who's calling the issue IOU flow. We're getting their information. So self, if you think about it that way. And also lender lookup. So who is the lender, and we're getting their information. So if you think about it, the borrower is the one who is initiating this issue IOU flow, and the lender is the counterparty per se, or the other member, as we say in Next Gen Corda. So now that we have my information, the lender information, what else do we need to create an IOU state? So all the information that was created in flow arguments includes amount and lender. So we have this information in flow args, which is great. So when we're creating an IOU state, we just need to use the UID, random UID. So this generates a unique identifier string. And then we get the name of the lender, the person initiating the flow's name. So in my case, it is the borrower or self. And then getting the amount, and we're parsing that into an integer. And lastly, we're providing the list of the public keys for the related participants. Next step, we obtain the notary name and the public key. And we set that to a side so that we can use it for later whenever we're writing the transaction builder. So pretty straightforward. And then when it comes to the transaction builder, what we need to provide is similar to Corda 4, except we need to include a set time window, which basically says that it needs to be valid between the specific time that you give it. So, but apart from that, everything else is the same. And actually, I don't think I have time to go through all of these flows one by one, but one thing to note is that, for example, I mentioned earlier that when you're creating an IOU state, the input should be empty, right? So actually, if you can see here, we didn't have an add input state. We didn't call the add input state function. We just called add output state. But when it comes to, like, for example, settle flow or transfer flow, we need to add the input state because it is consuming a state that's already existing on the ledger. So back to issue IOU flow. Once we've had the transaction builder and that's created, we then just convert the transaction builder to a UTXO signed transaction, and we sign this with virtual nodes ledger keys. And then we basically return this response body, and it calls the subflow, and it passes in finalize IOU flow. And within that function call, we pass through the signed transaction as well as the lender's name. And this line 115 will then return either a response body, or if it is not successful, it will return an error so that we know what's happening. And I found this super useful when I was developing this CorDapp, because in the past, if it didn't work, I would have to create my own exceptions to catch any problems, but this just makes it so much more streamlined and easy to see what's wrong. So I find this super, super helpful. So for the next 4 minutes, I don't know if I can do it, but I'm gonna try and run these flows on the Swagger. And again, I said, if you want to take a look into more depth what each of these flows do, feel free to take a look at that after this call on GitHub. So right, let's get started. So what matters here the most, as I said, flow management API. On Swagger, we have post and we have get. So let's start with post. And let's say I want Alice to create an IOU state with Alice being the borrower and with Bob being the lender of an amount of 10. Okay, I don't know, $10 or 10 whatever. Let's just say 10 for now to keep it simple. So let's copy Alice's holding identity short hash and paste it here. And all the description is needed here. So, you know, if you were just trying to figure it out yourself, it's not that complicated. You just have to read a little bit to understand what it's asking for. And in the request body, we want to pass through a JSON object to kind of state what we're asking for, right? So this is luckily already included in the README, so I don't have to type it manually, otherwise it would take forever. So client request ID, let's say create IOU 1, and flow class name, this is pretty much the name of the specific flow that we want to call. And in our case, I'm just going to copy and paste, but it's where your flow is. So in our case, we want to call issue IOU flow. I'm copying this from the GitHub that I created, by the way. So if you want to use the same afterwards, that's where you can copy it from. So yeah, so we're calling the issue IOU flow, and the request data we're going to pass through. What was it? It was amount and lender, right? So let's say amount is 20 and the lender is Bob. So I will just paste that here. And because I have slight tidiness issues, then I will just make sure that it's aligned correctly, and we run execute. And here, what do you see? So first, it returns a 202 response code, which is great. And we can see here the holding identity short hash, which is Alice's short hash. And the client request ID is create IOU1, which is what we defined here. And it says start requested. This means that it is running, but how do we check the status of this flow? So the way we do it is we go into get, And we put, again, Alice's short hash. So put it here, and the client flow ID or client request ID will be create IOU1, which we just, excuse me, we just put in. Oh, I have 1 minute left. I think I might run 5 minutes over time if that's okay. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a response of 200, which is fine. And it says the flow status is running. So we'll give a bit of time. Let's execute and say, oh, okay, now it's been updated and it's been completed, which is great. And we have the flow result, which is perfect. So at the moment, we don't have the ability to query specific flows and states. However, I've created the list IOU flow, which is great to just quickly take a look at what it looks like or that specific IOU state. And it doesn't take any request data. So I'll just execute it. And again, it said start requested, and I will just check that on the get side of things. So list IOU1. And here we can see that it's been completed, and the flow result is the ID, the unique ID of that IOU state. We have the lender, we have the borrower, we have the amount, which is 20, and amount paid is 0. So how do we carry out the settle flow? Similar to what we did just now with the create IOU, we're just going to update that to settle IOU1, and I'm going to update the flow that I want to use to settle IOU flow. And in terms of request data, the arguments required for settle IOU flow, let's take a look. It's asking for amount repayment and IOU ID. Where is IOU ID? Well, whenever we queried for the list IOU, this is the ID that we want to use, this unique identifier. So let's go to the post, and I'm going to put amount repayment, let's say $10 or 10, sorry, not dollars, just 10. And then IOU ID. ID is that specific string provided, and then we run execute. And here, start requested, and this is going to take a little bit of time, just like create IOU, but let's just take a look. Settle IOU. So as you can see, it is running, and the response code is 200. So Sylvestra asked a question, is this video, or will it be available on YouTube, and how to download the source code and Swagger YAML file? So to answer your question, this video will be uploaded onto YouTube. Maybe not this specific one, maybe Peter's one, which happened earlier on today, will be uploaded, but either one or maybe both will be. So don't worry about that. And in terms of the source code, as I mentioned, I put it in the chat already. That is the GitHub link to this source code. However, we will also upload it onto the Corda GitHub so that all the sample code for Next Gen Corda using the CSDE will be there. So don't worry about that. And Swagger is already, the setup for Swagger is already included in the CSDE. So also you don't have to worry about that. So hope that answers your question. And yeah, let's continue. So let's check again, see if it has completed. And yes, it has with the flow result. So in order to check this, we'll have to create another, we'll have to call list IOU flow again to basically list IOU flow checks for all the unconsumed IOU states in specific, but this is not something that already exists. Like I had to write the specific flow in order to check it. And this is something that we fed back to the team of engineers saying that it would be really helpful to have that ability to query the different states easily. So I guess that's something that maybe they will implement in the future, not sure yet. Anyways, so list IOU2, execute, and start requested. So let's go and check list IOU2. And as you can see here, so same ID, lender same, borrower is the same, amount is the same. The difference is amount paid is now 10 instead of 0, which makes sense because we settled and we paid back 10. All right, so the last flow I want to demonstrate is transfer. So let's say Bob is fed up of being the lender. They don't want to have to ask Alice for money anymore, and they decide to transfer the IOU to Charlie. So we will call transfer IOU and run transfer IOU flow. And in this case, because Bob is the identity who is initiating the flow, we then have to copy Bob's short hash and paste it into this field. And transfer IOU flow, let's see what it takes as arguments. It takes the new lender and also the unique identifiers. So new lender, I want it to be Charlie. So here I'll just copy Charlie. New lender, Charlie, and IOU ID. Oh, I always type that extra letter there. And the unique identifier, we just simply copy from the flow result that we had. Did I copy it? Okay, copied it. And then I'm just going to paste it into here. And let's run execute. So start requested, transfer IOU. Oh, to be fair, I probably should have named it transfer IOU 1 since this is the first one, but it's okay. That works too. So now that we have this client request ID, I'm just going to scroll down to get and paste that in there and make sure I also update the short hash because now it is Bob who is going to check this. And it is running. So we'll give it a moment. Almost done. In the meantime, if you have any more questions, feel free to put them in Q&A. Let's see. Okay. Oh, I see. Sorry, I should have put Alice's into here. Oh, sorry. Oops. Actually, it should be up here. So whenever we're creating the short hash, let's put Alice's and run this. And I'm changing it back to 1 because I didn't use 1 just now. So this will work fine. Start requested and paste this. Execute. Still running, almost done, hopefully. Okay, so now it's been completed. So in order to check what the IOU state looks like now, I'm just going to do list IOU, and let's do number 3. And it's an empty request data, execute. So start requested, list IOU 3, and execute. And as you can tell, the lender is now no longer Bob, it is actually Charlie. So that's basically everything that I wanted to show you. Of course, you can play around with this, clone the repo and play around with it as much as you like. And this is pretty much the interactions that we've been going through. So the post calls for issue and settle and transfer, and also settle partially. So we only did $10, that's settling partially. And then the get calls to check the flow results. And in production, this step can be omitted to check it. And yeah, as I already shown just now, it's between, we need to copy the unique IOU ID to be able to do settlement and transfer. All right. So with regards to next steps, we're going to have our next bootcamp session on the 23rd of February, where we'll cover the basics of working with Corda Membership Group Manager and also how to set up the network. So be sure to come along to that. It'll be in 2 weeks' time, same day, same Thursday. And there'll be, as I mentioned just now, there will be 2 different time zones or 2 different sessions adapted to different time zones. So I'll be there, hopefully see you there again. And the second step is, if you haven't already, be sure to join the developer platform and also sign up to our developer newsletter to be informed when Next Gen Corda GA releases out. And lastly, you can revisit all our recordings on the Corda YouTube channel and also the docs on docs.r3.com.